Everybody. Thank you very much for coming. This is the second time I have spoken out about the budget. The first time was a few days, actually after the budget had just been passed and a few days before the budget, or before the governor signed it. And at that time I was urging the governor to do the right thing. There were a number of provisions in the budget that were so egregious and so far, I think, outside the mainstream of what voters in Ohio want, that it was really incumbent upon him to do the right thing and line item veto some of those provisions. Now, he refused to do that. And now we're stuck with really not just one of the most extreme budgets in the history of Ohio, but also one of the most extreme budgets that's been passed by any legislative body in the country. If you just look at the score sheet, if you go through these various provisions, there's so many that are objectionable. We don't have time to get through all of them probably today. But just to summarize, first of all, it's bad for Ohio's children because we're still funding education now at a lower rate than we were under the previous administration. It's bad for seniors in particular and for anybody on a fixed income because the whole tax shift that has happened under this budget, it's increasing sales taxes. It will in the long run be increasing property taxes, and it's increasing or cutting income taxes where most of the benefits are going for folks at the higher end of the income scale. So it's particularly bad for a senior that's trying to maintain their own home and is on a fixed income. It's bad for middle class families in general because it's a shift. It's rewarding those who have done very well, and it's sticking the middle class with the bill. All of that is pretty clear. And by the way, that's not just one person's point of view or one campaign's point of view. That has been said loudly and repeatedly all over the state. If you look at the reactions of Ohio's newspapers, almost unanimously, they have panned this budget. And we have some of the quotes from various news outlets all over the state. They've said things like that this is a budget that is rewarding those who have done very well while punishing those in the middle class. They've said things like it puts the needs of the well-off ahead of those who are the poorest and in the middle class. It's said that it's putting things in the budget at the last second that don't belong in a budget bill and have prevented any real discussion or debate about some of those divisive things. The Toledo Blade said that the new state budget is equally regressive as either economic policy or social policy, and that for folks who aren't rich, women, and anyone else who would rather move forward than backward, that they need to insist on a different route. Now, the budget is bad in so many different ways when it comes to tax policy, but I have to say that if you had to rank the most egregious portions of it, it would have to do, in my opinion, with the very extreme policies that are represented in this budget when it comes to women's health in particular. This is a budget, we're having this discussion in 2013, this is a budget where you would think that this kind of discussion and debate would have to happen in another century. Because I can't believe, quite frankly, that we're still having this discussion in the 21st century. How do you explain that in the 21st century in Ohio, we're still having a discussion and having to object to provisions that defund Planned Parenthood, which is providing critical and life-saving services like breast exams and cancer screenings to so many Ohio women? Why are we still having this conversation in the 21st century? Why in this century are we still talking about women being forced to undergo medically unnecessary procedures? Why in the world are we talking about actually having regulations on what rape crisis counselors can tell the women that are coming to them in their greatest hour of need? Yeah. Why do politicians in Columbus believe that that should be inserted into a budget bill at the 11th hour with no debate and no discussion? Why did Governor Kasich sign these provisions into law? It's really given folks in Ohio a real sense not just of anger but of powerlessness, especially those provisions that I just mentioned. And I have to tell you, it is completely at odds with any life experience that I have had. Now, I had the experience when I worked in law enforcement to deal with the victims of sexual assault, both when I was an FBI agent and when I was a county prosecutor. I prosecuted people for rape and sexual assault. I dealt with the victims of sexual assault. I dealt with the rape crisis counselors who sometimes literally held their hand as they walked their way through a very difficult justice system to try to get justice. I totally understand focusing on that issue, but shouldn't our focus be on the individuals who perpetrate sexual assault, not the victims of sexual assault and those that actually assist them? And I'm not just saying that as somebody that's been in law enforcement or somebody that's a candidate for office, but as somebody that's a father and as a husband, because this isn't just an issue for women, and it's not just for an issue that would affect my 2 daughters, it affects my 2 sons. Because this is about how we treat women in this society and whether or not we're going to have a society where both men and women respect each other as equals. Now, one thing though that I disagree with some of the commentary that's happened in the few days since this budget has been passed is what can we do about this? Look, the anger that we've heard about this, which has been reflected really across the country but across the state certainly, we all know that that's happened. We all know that if there had been a fair fight and a fair debate, many of these provisions never would have become law. There's no question about that, I don't think. But where I think we've missed the boat is we are not powerless to do something about this. There are options. Even though some of this legislation took away options from women in Ohio, we still do have options to try to turn around this situation. And that story has not been told yet. And that's part of why we're here today, is to let people know that there is something that can be done about this. This isn't the end of the story. As much as Governor Kasich and his friends would like to pretend that this chapter has been closed now, I think the governor literally went fishing yesterday. He would rather talk about other things. This issue is still relevant, and there are things that we can do about it. And there are 3 things that we can do about it. Number 1 is there is an election next year, I'm aware of. But I don't want to just tell people that the only solution is to vote these folks out of office, although that's not an option that I discourage people from talking about. There's also some legal challenges that we can look at, and there's a lot of folks in what I would just call a coalition of people of goodwill that are looking at all of those possibilities. And I think you're going to see that in the next few weeks, because some of these provisions arguably violate not just Ohio law, but I think the United States Constitution. I don't know if it's constitutional, quite frankly, to tell a rape crisis counselor that they cannot give a rape victim all of the information that they're entitled to about what their options are. I'm not sure if you can restrict someone's freedom of speech in that way. I'm not sure that it's constitutionally clear that you can force a doctor to give a certain speech to their patient. Whether or not they believe that that speech that's been written by Governor Kasich and his friends in the legislature, whether they believe that that speech is accurate or true or medically legitimate, I'm not sure that we can force people to do that. Even if we, obviously we shouldn't force people to do that, but I'm not sure that legally under our Constitution we can actually do that. And so I think that those challenges may be coming forth. I'm not sure that we can tell a health clinic that they cannot, or a hospital that they cannot accept somebody who has had complications arising out of a legal medical procedure. I'm not sure that's legal to do that. I'm not sure that you can endanger the immediate health of a woman by restricting the types of healthcare facilities that can accept a patient. I'm not sure that that is consistent with the duty that every doctor has to protect their patients. Right. So I think there are going to be legal challenges on that, but there's another option that hasn't been talked about enough that I want to mention specifically today. The last time we saw something I think this egregious was in 2011 with the passage of Senate Bill 5. And there are a lot of parallels to what happened here and what happened with Senate Bill 5. You had a political party with a very extreme ideology that tried to force an extreme agenda, in that case having to do with workers' rights to organize. and forced it and kind of ramrodded it and railroaded it through a legislative process. But what was different was, because that wasn't a budget bill, there was an immediate kind of outlet for people's anger and frustration about that. And they immediately ended up taking it to the ballot. And that whole referendum process started within days of Senate Bill 5 being passed. And we all know the way that story turned out. Now, there's been frustration because the assumption is that we can't do that with this situation. But I don't think that's quite the case. Because although there are legal barriers to taking the entire budget to a referendum, it doesn't mean there are not portions of this budget, which quite frankly didn't even belong in a budget bill, that can't be taken to the ballot. So there's two different processes under Ohio law. There's a referendum, which actually stays a piece of legislation from going into effect immediately. But there's another process which is an initiated piece of legislation by collecting signatures from the citizenry. And it's about 3% of the folks that voted in the last gubernatorial election. And the way that the process works, we can get into a little bit more and we'll provide information to the media if they'd be interested in it. But basically, although it does not stay the legislation, we will have an opportunity, if there is a coalition of people who are interested in this. And I think that coalition would have to be larger than any one candidate or larger than any one campaign. But by collecting roughly 118,000 signatures, there is an opportunity to take certain extreme portions of this budget, get signatures from Ohioans all across the state, in 44 out of the 88 counties, and force the legislature to deal with this issue when they go back into session in January of next year. And what I like about that is, first of all, how about having the debate that was denied?
Yeah.
If Governor Kasich and his Republican allies really believed that these extreme measures when it comes to women's health were something that the state agreed on and that they believed in their position, they wouldn't have done it in the dead of night and inserted it at the 11th hour the way they did.
Yeah.
The initiative process is a chance to force a debate that was denied before. Now, the way the process works is once those signatures are collected and submitted, and you go through a process with the Secretary of State's office and the Ohio Attorney General's office, then the legislature has a certain amount of period to act, and they must act on that. If they either amend the legislation or they deny the legislation, then we have an opportunity to actually put it on the ballot. Now, since they are claiming that these provisions are something that all Ohio should agree on, they should welcome this discussion and debate. I have a feeling they're not going to. But this is a debate that people deserve to have. It was a debate that was denied in this process. It's going to give people an outlet to make sure that they know that our democratic system, although it fails us sometimes, as it did in this particular case, there are options that we have. Now, this is the beginning of a conversation. We have put up actually this morning a website that I hope is going to help foster this discussion. And it's called OhioansFightBack.org. And it gives you kind of some benchmarks of how to look at this. First of all, we go through and we talk about what's in this budget. And we have some links to some other resources to read more about what's in the budget. But it also talks about the way this process could work and how could we possibly have this initiative process to try to turn around some of this. And then it also gives us an opportunity, not just people that are in this campaign, but anybody in Ohio, maybe even somebody that's never been involved in a political campaign, but it gives them a way to say, okay, let's sign up for this and see if we can get something going here. You know, Ohio does have a history that when its elected leaders ignore them and take the state in an extreme direction. This state has a good history, most recently seen with the rebellion against Senate Bill 5. This state does have a history of standing up for what's right. Now, it has to be done by a coalition. This isn't something that can be just my own opinion or the folks in this room or just one campaign. This has to be a discussion of people of goodwill across the state to say we're not going to stand for what we've seen. And I can tell you that conversation has started. I've been talking with various allies across the state that I know are outraged about what they've been seeing here. And today's announcement, and this won't be the last one, but today's press conference is another step in continuing that conversation. And I'm optimistic that one way or another, we're going to turn this situation around. So I appreciate you coming, and I'll take any questions that you have.
Shooting for the start of 2015, when would the issue be before lawmakers?
So the way the process would work is first you have to get 1,000 signatures, and the 1,000 signatures just basically qualifies you then to get to start the process. And you also have to, in the ballot language that you're proposing has to be signed on to by those 1,000 folks. And then you go through a process with the Attorney General and the Secretary of State's office to ratify the ballot language. Once that process is done and the ballot language is approved, then you can start collecting the signatures, which is 3% of the folks that voted in the previous gubernatorial election. Now, the legislature is going to go back into session at the beginning of 2014 in January, and that's by statute and constitution when they will be called back into session. So we would have until that time to submit our approved signatures. Now, then they have a certain amount of time to act on the legislation. If they fail to act, or if they amend the legislation in any kind of significant way, then we can go ahead and put it on the ballot for the next general election, which would be the general election of 2014. So it would be the November election of 2014.
But given the fact that in January of 2014 you're still going to be dealing with the same legislature, why would you expect the outcome to be different?
Look, hope springs eternal. All right. look. It's the same thing as you know. When I called on the governor to line item veto some of the most extreme portions of the budget after the legislature passed it and before he signed it, I didn't have high hopes, but I felt like I should at least call on him to do that. And he did line item veto some portions of it having to do with spider monkeys and other things. He didn't really deal with the most egregious portions of it, of course, and I was asking him to line item veto not just the parts about women's health, but also some of these very regressive economic policies that are in the tax policies, also some of the things having to do with secrecy and preventing transparency in government. I did not have high hopes he was going to do it, but I called on him to do so. I think part of the political process is calling people out when they do something wrong. Yeah. I hope that the legislature has a change of heart on these things. I have a feeling that when they hear, not just from myself, but if they hear from an entire coalition, one that I think is going to represent the vast majority, certainly, of women in Ohio, and I think a majority of men as well, then I think you might see some politicians in the legislature rethink this. You know, it's much easier to vote for something when you don't have any debate and discussion about it than when you actually have to defend your votes to your constituents. That never really happened in this process. Now, but if they act in the way that they have in this previous legislative session, then the way the process works is then it goes directly on the ballot. So if they fail to act on it, or if they amend it or water it down in some way that is contrary to the spirit of the legislation, then the process allows us to put it on the ballot directly. And I have no doubt what that outcome would be. But look, I don't underestimate how difficult it is to get something on the ballot, which is why I say I have a certain role to play, and I'm trying to move the flag forward here by discussing this as a real action. But this is something that's very difficult. These ballot initiatives take a lot of work and a lot of energy, and we have to translate all this anger and disappointment and frustration that we've seen in the last few days, and we have to be able to channel it into a productive way. And that would be one way to do it. I don't think it's necessarily the only way to do it, because if it goes on the ballot, we would be one part of that coalition, but it would have to be a really broad-based coalition if we were going to be able to overturn this.
So will your campaign be collecting the signatures?
Well, right now we have almost 1,000 volunteers for the campaign. And we do have a dialogue with our campaign volunteers on a number of issues. And we're going to start that dialogue actually today on our internal campaign communications, our Facebook page and so forth, we're going to be asking our own volunteers, is this something that you want to put your effort behind between now and the end of the year? And we'll see what the reaction is. So I wouldn't say that we're going to be in the driver's seat about everything that would happen with the ballot initiative, because again, that would have to be a coalition. But we would certainly be willing to be a part of it, or at least I'm willing to be a part of it. We'll see the way that the folks that have volunteered for the campaign will respond to it. What I can tell you, Joe, so far is what we've been hearing from folks is, okay, we're certainly ready to campaign in 2014, but is there something that we can do now? The thing about Senate Bill 5 that I thought was just a beautiful representation about the way the democratic process should work is that you had a legislature and a governor that overreached and did something extreme, and you had immediate consequences to that, where people could channel their disagreement into something practical that was politically practical. And that's what you don't have here. People feel like at the 11th, rightfully so, that at the 11th hour, something was put into law that took away their rights, particularly women's rights, and they never even got to have a say over it. They never even got to have a debate over it. And we'll see what the response is, but I think the response is going to be pretty positive.
We've heard the governor say that legal efforts, for example, against Jobs Ohio, or, sort of the left just being sore losers on the fact that they're not in control of this process. And I'm sure we'll hear that when we ask him about this today. What's your response to the idea that these were the elected majorities that passed this?
Well, I would say a couple things. Number one is the whole Jobs Ohio scheme has resulted in litigation that is being brought by progressive groups and conservative groups. Wanting to have transparency in government and openness in government is not an ideological issue. That isn't a liberal issue or a conservative issue. It's just a good government issue. Taxpayer money is the taxpayer's business. And most conservatives I know believe in that principle. And by the way, I've run economic development programs as a mayor and as a county official. And you can talk to the folks that we've worked with on economic development projects. I see no value in this secretive system. And I would also say to you that during my time in law enforcement as an FBI agent, when you saw corruption happen at a city level or a state level, I think that happens when you have a closed process. So to me, again, Jobs Ohio is of dubious legality, but as public policy, it's a terrible idea. The last thing I would say is, in terms of saying, well, we won the election, I don't remember Governor Kasich campaigning on that issue in 2010. He only won by about 77,000 votes. And if he had campaigned on issues like raising everybody's sales taxes and raising property taxes and forcing rape crisis centers or preventing them from giving full information to the victims that seek their assistance, or making government more secretive, I don't think he would have won that election.
Ed, you mentioned the word corruption. Part of your calling card is that you fight corruption. In the 30 months or so that John Kasich's been governor, do you have any reason to believe that he or any member of his administration in any way has been engaged in anything that resembles corrupt practices?
Yes.
And
because in my opinion, the creation of Jobs Ohio is basically a slush fund that is unaccountable, where it can, where donors to the Republican Party or anonymous donors to Jobs Ohio itself can then get benefits from Jobs Ohio or other state programs is per se a corrupt practice. Now, is it going to result in somebody's indictment or conviction? There's different levels of corruption, but I think that it is fostering a corrupt environment. Absolutely.
Will your campaign file any of the legal challenges that you were talking about?
Possibly. And there are discussions going on with a lot of folks about that right now. I think that there are a number of interested parties and groups that are looking at filing litigation. And there's a couple different possibilities. There's a possibility that we could initiate some of those, and there's also a possibility that we could file an amicus brief. I think there's also government entities that may file amicus briefs as well, and so I would refer you to what my county did with some of the voting rights issues. Again, when state government, under Governor Kasich and his allies, Republican allies in the legislature, when they passed some very extreme rules having to do with voting access, there was litigation about it, and my county was, I believe, the only county in Ohio that ended up filing an amicus brief to say that no, you cannot change the rules for early voting at the 11th hour. And actually our brief, I'm proud that Cuyahoga County's amicus brief was actually cited by the Sixth Circuit when a lot of those rules were thrown out. So I think there's a couple different directions I could go.
Are you looking at just doing an initiated statute on just the provisions that deal with women's health care, or are you going to go out for multiple parts of the budget?
That's something that we've had a lot of discussion about, and that's just kind of a strategic question, because to me this is the beginning of the conversation, it's not the end of it. And I can't kind of impose on a coalition exactly what portions of it I think should be challenged. I mean, if it were up to me, I'd like to challenge, half a dozen or more. But I think you do have to be strategic, and you have to make sure that you don't have voter fatigue. And I think you have to consult with your partners and say, where is there the greatest chance of making a powerful statement, and where's your greatest chance of success? There's a number of provisions there that I would like to see taken out. I think that the women's health provisions are the most egregious and have provoked the most justifiable outrage. I think they're the most likely to be overturned by the voters. Not by a small margin, by the way, I think by an enormous margin. I think you're going to see polling coming. I predict you're going to see polling coming out, especially if any polling is done on this rape crisis issue, this gag order that's being placed on rape crisis counselors. And I think you're going to see polling showing that the vast majority of Ohio voters, men and women, think that it's outrageous. Outrageous. And so I think that's probably would be the easiest, so to speak, to have repealed, but I wouldn't limit it at that point, because I don't want to short circuit the discussion that we have with our partners.
So Ed, on the rape crisis provision, it's something that's been kind of in the news for more than a week, the debate going back and forth. It was in a separate bill, and that bill was unanimously supported by House Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, can you just comment on that, on how members of your party unanimously supported a bill that had that stuff in it, and now are criticizing the same provision for being
because here's what happened. In one of the most, what I really think was one of the most cynical things that this legislature has certainly ever done, the leadership of the legislature has ever done, and maybe any legislature has ever done, is they try to put the Democrats in the legislature in an absolutely impossible position, where they inserted this language where they said that a rape crisis counselor could not actually tell the victims that were seeking their assistance, give them full information about what their options were. And then they threatened the Democratic minority that if they didn't go along with that language, they would cut out the funding entirely. So they basically placed a gun to the head of the Democrats in the legislature and said, if you don't go along with this, we're going to eliminate the funding. And again, I have to ask the question, in the 21st century, what problem was that provision solving? I dealt with a number of victims of sexual assault and rape, and they have a long list of problems and traumas that they have to deal with. And you do, when you're a prosecutor on a case, or you're investigating a case, you really get to know the individuals that find themselves in that circumstance. I never heard the victim of a sexual assault say that one of the things that they were struggling with was the fact that the rape crisis counselor had given them too much information. So I don't understand what it was solving in the first place. But the Democrats in the legislature were placed in an unenviable position, and their hope was that that extreme language would be taken out in the conference committee, or the governor could have certainly corrected the problem. They didn't initiate that language, they didn't write that language, and I think what you'll see is if there's a ballot challenge on it, look, it will be crystal clear then who's in agreement with that language and who isn't. It will be crystal clear. And I don't think you're going to see any Democratic member of the legislature say that they don't believe that the provision should be taken out. I don't think you'll see that at all. Yes, sir.
You said that you're going to prioritize at this point focusing on the women's health issues within the state budget, but I think it's generally regarded that economic issues are kind of on the forefront of voters' minds. So if you think that the tax plan of the budget is so harmful to the economy, why wouldn't you focus on that specific aspect instead?
I think it's hard to separate them, to be honest with you. I mean, as I've talked to voters across Ohio, they think in general the budget is a disaster, and they think the process wherein it was passed wasn't respectful to the democratic process. It gets a little bit more complicated legally when you try to unwind the fiscal portions of the budget. So without getting too much in the weeds of it legally, there's a much cleaner way to fix the problems, I think, on some of the women's health issues, because they are not tied as much to the whole structure of the state budget. If you take away a budget is constructed, I can tell you this from having been a mayor, having been a county executive, having been in a municipal government for 12 years and county government now for my 3rd year, a budget is created with, it's kind of like a 3-legged stool or a 4-legged stool. And if you start repealing portions of it that finance the budget, it creates an enormous ripple effect. It becomes very difficult to do that. I'm not saying it's impossible, and I haven't given up on it, and we are looking at if there are specific portions that we think are objectionable and could be taken out, but you also get, I think, there's an increased chance that you're going to have legal challenges on it as well. And this is something where if we are going to put something on the ballot, we want it to be relatively clean and straightforward. I think there's a better chance to do that on the women's health issues, but I haven't given up on looking at some of the social justice issues that I think are affected by the tax provisions. Yes, sir.
Why are you leaving the referendum option on the table? The Supreme Court has left the door open for you to come after some non-financial aspects of the budget. And so why, if these provisions are so egregious, why let them take effect for a year and a half?
A couple things. Number one is I still think that's an open question legally. And it is a Herculean effort to get these things turned around. And I would hate to, I think it would just add to people's cynicism and despair, quite frankly, if we got halfway down the road on a referendum and then the Supreme Court changed its mind or expressed itself in a way that obviated that particular strategy. I mean, a lot goes into this, and to not know whether or not legally we would be able to prevail on it, I think is a tough road to go. Secondly, we would be on a very tight time frame, a very, very, very tight time frame. And again, you're talking about a budget bill is funding the provisions of government. And as we've seen in Washington, when you don't have certainty about budgetary provisions, it causes all types of repercussions as a result, I think. So I think we have to be careful about really trying to alter fundamentally the economics of the budget, so to speak. We also have, lastly, we have a little bit longer runway, so to speak, when it comes to the initiated legislation, where the clock doesn't run out quite so quickly. Gives us a little bit more time to put together the coalition that we're going to need to do this.
So you're saying you're going to take the lead in putting together this coalition, or are you just proposing this as an option that you'd be willing to do?
I've been having conversations ever since it passed, actually, with, again, people all over the state. Some of them are representing organizations that have already made their opinions known on this issue. And I think I'm going to be one person, and I think our campaign is going to be one part of the equation. But if this is successful, actually, I don't think it's just about one candidate or one campaign. The people that were outraged by the provisions of this budget are not exclusively Democrats, not exclusively my supporters. It's really broad-based. And if a initiative campaign is going to be successful, it can't be just about one candidate. I think I have a role to play. I think as somebody that's running for governor, I have a responsibility to speak out and show leadership where I can. I think this is one way to show it, to move the conversation forward, but I don't think I can dominate the entire conversation as it goes forward.
Really, from a political strategy viewpoint, given the role that women played in the last election, I mean, it's politically advantageous to you to have this issue on the ballot in 2014, yes?
Are you just offering free advice? Or,
that has to be part of your thinking here, right?
Well, look, sometimes good policy is good politics. Sometimes bad policy is bad politics. Do I think it's good for Governor Kasich politically to insert himself between a woman and the decisions that she has to make with her doctor? No. Do I think that's going to hurt him politically? Yeah, I do. He can fix that anytime he wants. He could have fixed it. That's why I called him out on it beforehand. But I'll let the politics will take care of itself. But anybody that is kidding themselves, or if Governor Kasich and his friends are kidding themselves that this is just a political issue, I think they're going to find out that it crosses all political boundaries and lines. There's people that I've heard from that are unbelievably fired up about this issue who have never worked on any political campaign and consider themselves above politics. Well, it's fine to say you're above politics, but when politicians insert themselves into your life, then it brings everybody into the political